Well, hello everybody and welcome to this month's RSA webinar. We've had a bit of a break, but we're back and raring to go. My name is Meredith Doig. I'm president of the Rationalist Society, which is Australia's oldest free thought group. Now, before we begin, I'd like to invite you to join with me in acknowledging the traditional owners of country and custodians of country throughout Australia and acknowledge their continuing connections to the land and to the sea and to the community on this land. Tonight, it's really a great pleasure to have with us our first international guest, and that person is the Chief Executive of the organisation which is probably the RSA's equivalent in the UK, the National Secular Society. Their Chief Executive is Stephen Evans, and welcome, Stephen. Stephen's been working for the NSS in some capacity or other for over 15 years, and he was appointed the Chief Executive in 2017. And in that time, he's become a regular media commentator on the role of religion in UK in public and political life. Now, as usual, Stephen will talk for about 20 or 30 minutes before we head into Q&A. As usual, if there is a question that occurs to you during Stephen's presentation, please type it up in the chat box and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. We have had some people who've sent in questions beforehand. So with that short introduction, Stephen, can I invite you to take over and present on the nature of establishment? First of all, what is establishment, and then what is disestablishment?
Okay, thank you very much, Meredith. Good day, everyone. Absolute pleasure to join you today to talk about this relationship that we have in the UK between church and state and the Crown, actually, because all the three of those institutions are very much mixed up in the ongoing tug of war between tradition and progress that we have here in the UK. So you should all see the slides that I've prepared for today's talk. So I'm not sure you know too much about the work we do, but let me just explain our work a little bit. So with the support of our members, we support and promote the principles of freedom, fairness, and human rights. More specifically, we work towards a secular state. So that's a state where everyone's free to live their lives without other people being imposed on them, other people's religion, being imposed on them or society, which I think is the essence of secularism. So, right, bear with me. I've just got a slight problem with the slides that I'm trying to sort out. There we go. That's better. Okay, so to begin with, if you don't mind, just a little bit of history, because it's very much related to our campaigns of today. So our work began in 1866 with this man, Charles Bradlaugh, who was a huge maverick figure in the late 19th century. He was a radical free thinker, an outspoken atheist, a liberal who was elected as an MP to Parliament in 1880 by the people of Northampton, but he was then denied his seat in Parliament on account of his well-known atheist beliefs, because at the time MPs had to swear a religious oath. An alternative affirmation was available for Jews and for Quakers, but it wasn't available for atheists. And as a very well-known outspoken atheist, he was refused this option of swearing the religious oath. Nevertheless, he did attempt on several occasions to take his seat, and after one such occasion in 1881, which involved a brief physical struggle with the sergeant-at-arms depicted here in the slide, he was actually imprisoned in a small prison cell which sits just below the clock face on the Elizabeth Tower, which you may know as Big Ben. So Bradlaugh was in fact the last person to be imprisoned in Big Ben. Bradlaugh had to go on to contest and win 4 subsequent by-elections before he was finally allowed to take his seat. And when he did, Bradlaugh introduced the Oaths Act, which in 1888 gave all MPs the right to affirm rather than swear a religious oath, and that's a right that's enjoyed by many MPs to this day. And that little picture on the right, on your right there, is just Bradlaugh celebrating that victory. Now, the importance of Bradlaugh has now been recognised in our national parliament, where he was once ostracised and imprisoned, with a portrait bust that we worked on with the Parliamentary Arts Committee. So yeah, that's how we began. And since then, over the last 150 years or so, secularists have been at the forefront of many social reforms related to the advancement of women's rights, birth control, reproductive freedoms, the liberalisation of Sunday trading laws, and more recently, the introduction and the shaping of equality legislation that outlawed discrimination on grounds of religion or belief, including non-belief, and the abolition of blasphemy laws as well in England and Scotland, at least. And in the struggles to bring about these reforms, the NSS has always played a prominent role, sometimes a decisive one. But there is definitely more to do. We continue to remain relevant, I think, for 2 particular reasons. Firstly, because growing religious fundamentalism threatens to erode the freedoms that we've already won and secured. But also because we haven't yet achieved all of our ambitions, because religious privilege very much remains a feature of British political and public life, which brings me to the topic of today's talk. So despite the UK having an increasingly secular outlook and a pluralistic population, the Church of England is still officially recognised. It's still officially established as the state church, and there are still many privileges that flow from that. So for all of our successes, there is still definitely plenty more to do. And one of the toughest nuts to crack has been disestablishment. So the relationship between the church and the state, and of course the crown or the monarchy, hasn't often been a particularly salient political issue in Britain. Constitutional issues, I would say, rarely are. But I think there is a growing call for some sort of democratic renewal, and it has risen up the political agenda recently due to several factors, which I'll come on to, which I think mean we can be a little bit more optimistic of change now than perhaps we have been for some time. But to begin, I'll just spend a little bit of time setting out what establishment is, and to just set out what it looks like in a UK context. So as you may know, establishment refers to the formal relationship between the church and a religion and the state that it operates in. So the United Kingdom is made up of 4 countries: England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. The Church of England is only established in one of those countries. It's only established in England. There are no established churches in Northern Ireland, nor in Wales. The Church of Ireland was disestablished in 1871. Disestablishment took place in Wales in 1920. The Church of Scotland has a special status in Scotland, but it is wholly independent of the state. Now, probably the most visible manifestation of Anglican establishment is probably the reigning monarch, the king being both the head of state as well as head of the church, holding the titles of Supreme Governor of the Church of England and Defender of the Faith. And for the avoidance of doubt, that faith is the one true Protestant faith. Now, these titles date back to the reign of King Henry VIII and England's break from Rome and the break from the authority of the Pope and the Catholic Church. It is actually a requirement in law for our monarch to be in communion with the Church of England. So this means our head of state really has to be a practicing Protestant Christian. So we reserve the role of head of state in this country for practicing Christians. Now, the coronation that you can see here of King Charles took place last May. This was a state occasion, but primarily a religious affair. During this ceremony, our head of state vowed to maintain the Protestant religion, maintain and preserve the settlement of the Church of England and its doctrine and its worship, and to preserve the rights and the privileges of its bishops. The sovereign was then anointed with holy oil being rubbed into his chest, and then blessed and consecrated by the archbishop. So It was a very grand affair, but the event was largely unnecessary. It was more for the church, it was more for the church than it was for anyone else. It wasn't particularly for the monarch. It wasn't particularly for the country. No other European monarchy has a coronation. The death of an existing monarch is what makes a new monarch, not the coronation. So it was pretty much unnecessary, as the Australian-born human rights barrister, who's actually a UK constitutional expert, Geoffrey Robinson, he described the coronation as a legal irrelevance, just a silly and superstitious Church of England ritual. Charles had no need at all to be crowned by a minority church. It was an expensive irrelevance too. Our requests for information on the state's spending on the coronation have so far been denied, but we will eventually know what the cost was. Now, the previous coronation, the coronation of Queen Elizabeth, took place in June in 1953. Since then, Britain's religion and belief landscape has changed a lot. Religious adherence and church attendance has plummeted. Many minority religions has grown, as has non-belief. Nevertheless, the King's coronation looked and felt very similar to the previous one. This time there was a slight nod to multi-faithism. Various religious leaders and a humanist were invited, and even allowed to carry the King's gloves at one point, but it was an unmistakably Anglican affair. The point of the coronation is for the King to be anointed by the Archbishop of Canterbury to transform him into an agent of God. And all of this overlapping of church and head of state, it really entrenches religious privilege in the UK, and it gives the monarchy a kind of quasi-religious character.
I should say, Stephen, that you do realise that your head of state is our head of state too. And Charles is also
he's head of state, but not head of the Church of Australia, is he? That religious role doesn't exist in Australia. But, you know, the monarchy's religious role is really underpinned by an assumption that all future monarchs will be believing Anglicans. And as I'll come on to a little bit later on, I don't think that's a safe assumption. Now, the question of whether we should retain a monarchy at all perhaps goes beyond the secularists' remit, albeit a large proportion of secularists will have Republican sympathies or tendencies. But if the royal family's legitimacy heralds from this divine right to rule, where does that legitimacy come from in a post-Enlightenment society that no longer recognises the divine right of kings? Now, it can be argued that the legitimacy comes from the will of the people, but ever since the King's coronation, support for the monarchy has certainly reduced. I know in Australia, polling consistently shows a majority in favour of a republic. Here in the UK, I think 60% still support a monarchy, but only 37% of 18 to 24-year-olds do. So there may be trouble ahead for the crown. But if we are to have a head of state, someone to represent us all and protect all of our rights and freedoms, then we argue that that role should be secular and free from any sort of religious entanglement.
And we argue that it should be an Australian for Australia.
A very reasonable point to make, I would say. Anyway, so the monarchy, that is one pillar of establishment. Now, another manifestation of church establishment is what we call the bishop's bench. So this is the automatic right of 26 Anglican clerics to sit as lawmakers in our upper chamber, the House of Lords. So the UK is the only parliament in Europe to have explicit religious representation. Outside of Europe, only Iran, a theocracy, has such an arrangement in its national parliament. So we're not in particularly good company. All parliamentary sessions in the UK begin with Anglican prayers, House of Commons and Lords. There's always at least one bishop in the House of Lords when it's sitting, but there are often several, especially when they have a particular interest in what's being debated, such as assisted dying laws, for example. When the benches were full, the last time the issue was debated, the bishops said they were united in their opposition to any sort of assisted dying reform. Bishops as well are treated with a sort of unique deference, in the House of Lords. They can take part in all business of the House, including tabling and asking questions of ministers, leading or speaking in debates, scrutinising legislation, voting, and serving on parliamentary committees. So the privileges of seats in the House of Lords extends far beyond their presence in the chamber, far beyond their right to vote. It gives church bishops really unique access to ministers, lawmakers, and the corridors of power, influence far beyond that of any other religious or secular special interest group. Now, a 2021 YouGov, it's a polling company in the UK, their survey found that only 16% of British people believe bishops should be entitled to a seat in the House of Lords. So the bishop's role is not particularly popular amongst the public. And if, as widely expected, we have a Labour government after the next election, Lords reform may possibly be on the agenda, and we'll certainly be arguing for the bishops or their removal to be part of those reforms. A recent survey also of serving Church of England clergy suggested that many of those are also in favour of reform, with around half thinking that the seats reserved for them should be shared with other faith leaders. Now, this isn't the kind of reform that we'd be in favour of. Religious interests are already very well represented in the Lords by ordinary peers. I think the whole concept of reserved seats for clerics and faith leaders is nonsensical in a modern liberal democracy. And a multi-faith approach of appointing a variety of peers to represent a variety of religious interests or religious groups would, I think, be quite divisive. I think it would be wholly unworkable anyway. Maybe that's something we can explore in the questions afterwards, but I'd simply argue that seats as of right for religious leaders should be removed. Now, another aspect of establishment is the role Parliament plays in church governance. So the King appoints an Anglican Member of Parliament, an Anglican MP, from the governing party to be an intermediary, if you like, between church and state, and I suppose hold the church to account as well in Parliament by answering questions and speaking officially on behalf of the Church of England in our Parliament. So many of the internal laws passed by the Church of England's decision-making body, that's the General Synod, a lot of those laws have to be approved in both the House of Parliament and the House of Lords before they can come into effect. So this means that although the governance of the Church of England has been delegated to the Church's Parliament, the General Synod, our national Parliament remains legislatively supreme. So in many ways, the Church is subservient to our Parliament. In fact, Parliament has the authority to pass laws affecting the Church without any Church involvement whatsoever. By convention, it doesn't do that, but it certainly can do if it wants to. And the state also plays a key role in filling positions within the church itself. So bishops and archbishops are appointed by the ruling monarch, acting on advice from the Prime Minister. So until the mid-1970s, the Prime Minister had an unfettered right to advise on appointments, and the church had absolutely no role whatsoever in the appointment process of its own bishops and archbishops, although it was usually consulted as a matter of courtesy. But the role of the Prime Minister in selecting or advising on archbishops becomes problematic if the Prime Minister isn't an Anglican. Again, I think there's just an assumption there that Prime Minister will be an Anglican. And it's particularly a problem if they're a Catholic. So under the law, no person professing the Roman Catholic religion is allowed to advise the King or the Queen, the monarch, on the selection of Church of England bishops. So this rule dates back to 1701, something called the Act of Settlement. That was a law to ensure that we had a Protestant succession to the English throne. But this very much anti-Catholic piece of legislation put our former Prime Minister Boris Johnson in quite a difficult situation. So instead, another minister had to be drafted in to advise the Queen. Bizarrely, our current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, who's a Hindu, can advise the King on the selection of bishops. Only Catholics are explicitly banned. Appointments to other church positions as well, such as deans, deacons, priests, and all the rest of it, are also shaped by the views of state officials. So there's plenty of church interference going on in state affairs, but there's also plenty of state interference and meddling going on in church affairs, which as a secularist, I wouldn't support. I think the Church of England, like all other religions, should enjoy complete independence. Now, perhaps another aspect of establishment is the continued role that the church plays in state education in Britain. So the role of the church and now other faith groups play in our schools is definitely in part down to the privileged role that the church enjoys in our political and civil life. So a quarter of all primary schools in England are run by the Church of England, which funded by the state, but run by the Church of England, which gives the church really significant influence over education policy. And this is the reason I think that we still have a law requiring collective worship, a daily act of broadly Christian collective worship in all schools. We have an exemption from the equality law that allows church schools to discriminate in their admissions in favour of church-going families and children, and to select teachers on the basis of their faith and sometimes their sexual orientation too. And we also have an outdated version of religious education that allows religious groups to largely determine the syllabus. And because the church runs schools, that means other faith groups have also now been allowed and encouraged to run schools too. So you can't have Church of England schools, but then say to Muslims, Hindu, Jews and Sikhs, you can't have your schools. So now we have schools segregated along religious and therefore sometimes racial and ethnic lines, which I think is a wholly regressive approach to state education that really undermines integration and cohesion in the UK. So the presence of an established church and the Church of England's influence over education policy is, I think, a significant barrier to us achieving this secular education system that we want, that's free from religious discrimination and control. Due to its established status, the church also has a prominent role in state occasions. So the church has a dominant role in our National Service of Remembrance, which is why our annual ceremony at the Cenotaph, where we remember those killed in conflict, it often resembles a church service where the Bishop of London leads Christian prayers. But if remembrance is important, and I think it is, then I think it needs to be meaningful to people. And if it's not meaningful to people, people will switch off. And if they switch off, the risk is that they forget. And given that religion is such a turn-off for so many people, particularly younger people, I think our national remembrance and other national occasions having this religious flavour is far from ideal. So that's what establishment looks like in the United Kingdom. There are two principal objections that we have to there being an established church. First of all, it's unfair. I think the legal existence of a legally enshrined national religion and an established church really privileges one part of the population, one institution, and one set of beliefs. So it undermines the principle of equal citizenship. The second objection is that it's archaic and it's inauthentic. We are no longer a Christian country. Christianity is one major influence among many that shape the current British way of life and the values that we share. But these values of tolerance, justice, fairness, they're not religion-specific values, they're secular values too. So we can't in any meaningful way be described as a Christian country. And as you can see on this slide here, even Anglican clergy agree with this point. A recent poll commissioned by the Times newspaper found that 64% of Anglican clergy think that Britain can no longer be described as a Christian country. Now, I mentioned earlier that there are reasons why we might be a little bit more hopeful of change now than we perhaps have been for a while. And that's because several things that have happened in recent years have started to perfectly illustrate some of the objections that I just mentioned. So the death of Queen Elizabeth last year meant for the first time in around 70 years, we had a coronation. So this brought the relationship between church and state into focus. And it means our head of state's role of defender of the faith has been and will continue to be opened up to scrutiny. So King Charles, quite quite a while before he was king, made clear his intention to be a defender of faith generally, not only the faith. He wanted to be a defender of faith. So this fits with the role that the Church of England has sort of assumed for itself as promoting a multi-faith rather than a secular Britain. They claim to be a voice for all faiths. The Church very much wants to be regarded as a means by which other denominations and faith communities can be privileged or elevated in public life, but only on the basis, of course, that the Church of England will be uniquely privileged. But when push came to shove at the coronation last year, nothing changed, and Charles became defender of the faith. And despite the king's very vocal support for religious freedom, which is to be admired, I think, the monarch's religious role is very much underpinned by this assumption that all future monarchs will be believing Anglicans, and that, I don't think, can any longer be assumed. Now, there is some growing speculation as to whether the Prince of Wales, Prince William, will want to take the title of Supreme Governor of the Church of England when he becomes king. William, like many people of his age, most people his age, isn't a regular churchgoer, and according to a new book by the royal biographer, I forget his name, I think Robert Hardman, I think it is, he says it's no secret that William does not share the king's sense of the spiritual, let alone the late Queen's unshakable devotion to the Anglican Church. That's what he said. And a senior palace figure has been quoted as saying that Prince William is not instinctively comfortable in a faith environment. But under the Act of Settlement, the law I mentioned earlier, Prince William couldn't actually become king without being in communion with the Church of England. Now, whilst this criteria could quite easily be met on account of his baptism, the optics of a supreme governor of the Church of England and defender of the faith not being particularly religious, not being a particularly enthusiastic member of the Church of England, I think that would undermine both church and state. Somewhat embarrassing and demeaning for the church, I think, to have a supreme governor and defender of the faith that doesn't even practice the faith or believe in its doctrine. So removing the religious role of our head of state would remove the restriction on the monarch's freedom of religion or belief, signalling, I think, the UK's true commitment to this important principle. So these things really have to be separated. The role of head of state in the UK being reserved exclusively for Christians is really at odds with the monarch's supposed support for freedom of religion or belief, and it really contravenes every principle of non-discrimination ever drawn up. Our head of state should be free to hold any religious beliefs they wish, and under our current constitutional settlement, that's simply not possible. But not only does Anglican establishment make second-class citizens out of non-Anglicans, it also makes second-class citizens out of lesbian and gay people. So in recent years, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, has reaffirmed his church's official rejection of gay sex. And the Church of England, which is permitted to carry out officially recognised marriages in the UK, still refuses to carry out same-sex marriages, which are, of course, legal in Britain. Now, of course, the Church's doctrine is its own affair, and many clergy, it has to be said, are at odds with its own doctrine. But as we've been pointed out in this advert that we've been running in the media, it is really problematic for an officially homophobic institution to be an arm of the state. And as one opposition party member, one Labour Party member of Parliament said recently, the overwhelming view of MPs is that it's not sustainable for our established church to be institutionally homophobic and to actively exclude a portion of the population whom they have a duty to serve. So this is Ben Bradshaw. He's actually a practicing Anglican, and that's his take on that. Now, the issue of same-sex marriage is certainly a divisive one within the church itself. It is actually an issue the church could eventually split over. A majority, 53% of Anglican clergy, think the church should allow priests to conduct same-sex weddings. 65% think the church's teaching that homosexual practice is incompatible with scripture. 65% think that should be dropped, but nevertheless, for the foreseeable future, there is no prospect of this doctrine changing. Largely because the wider Anglican communion, which Welby wants to keep together, are largely not in favour of same-sex relationships. So the Church of England's conservative position on issues of sexuality has really alienated it from the British people, including those in the pews and the clergy, who are much more liberal in their outlook. So Justin Welby, the Archbishop, has said that he would rather see the church disestablished than split over same-sex marriage. So this still may be the issue that triggers disestablishment. Now, increasing secularization and religious diversity also highlights not only the unfairness of the status quo, but also the sheer absurdity of it. So the most recent census published last year, it showed that the percentage of Christians in England and Wales has fallen from 72% in 2001 to 59% in 2011, and now down to 46% in 2021. So that's going down 13% every 10 years. And if it continues at that rate, it's going to be a very small percentage by 2050. But already Christianity and Christians are in a minority situation. Lots of other polling in recent years paints a picture of declining faith and growing non-religiosity. So the UK is the sixth least religious country in the world. Social attitude surveys have found that half of British people have no religion. That goes up to 70% for those aged between 18 and 24. Just 0.9% of the English population worship in Anglican churches on any given Sunday. So that's some way short of the 46% of Christians who identify as Christian in the census. And just 1% of young adults say they in any way identify with the Church of England. But it's not just affiliation, it's attitudes too. So 60% of Brits say that religion isn't important in their lives. 81% agree that religious practice is a private matter, should be separated from the political and economic life of the country. More of us in the UK oppose than support the idea of us having a state religion. 58% of the adult population oppose state-funded religious schools. British citizens, including churchgoers, overwhelmingly reject the church's position on abortion, on assisted dying, and on same-sex marriage. So establishment just doesn't sit well with the reality of modern Britain. It's very much a hangover from a bygone age. It's out of date. It's not particularly inclusive. So ever-increasing secularity and falling affiliation within the Church of England and this growing religious diversity that we're seeing is another reason why disestablishment is desirable and, I think, inevitable. There are also arguments for disestablishment coming from the Anglican and broader Christian perspective too. Some Anglicans within the church itself are arguing now that the church should voluntarily relinquish its privileges and its established status to free the church to pursue its own mission with greater authenticity. Going back to that recent survey of clergy in the Times newspaper that I mentioned, it found that more than half of Church of England priests thought the church's established status should be reviewed, including nearly 12% of priests who said the church should absolutely be disestablished. And at a recent event that we've organised a couple of events that have included Church of England clergy, and we had one in Parliament recently where we gave a platform to Anglicans who want greater church autonomy, so people who recognise the importance of state impartiality and also echo our call for disestablishment. So if secularism is to succeed, I think we need religious moderates on side, and that's very much part of our strategy. The current Archbishop of Canterbury has suggested recently that disestablishment wouldn't be a disaster for the church. He acts really cool and nonchalant about disestablishment. It's really hard. They don't really defend it with any great rigor. But at the same time, he's also made clear that the church wouldn't be initiating change. So at least not yet. So for the time being, those who benefit from religious establishment, particularly the bishops, they seem quite keen to preserve it, particularly the bishops whose seats in the House of Lords give them that kind of political lobbying power and prestige. But bishops aside, I think many Christians would support disestablishment. And I say this just to point out that disestablishment need not be this big clash between church and state, or the religious and the non-religious. I think it could be progressed with a mutual understanding on both sides that formal separation could stand to benefit both. All sides should be able to recognise that maintaining a minority established church in a religiously pluralistic and increasingly secularised nation is really unwise and unsustainable. And it gets in the way of forging a more inclusive British identity, I think, that all citizens can feel equally part of. So these are the points that we've been making in our lobbying and our advocacy work and in the media for many years now. And now we're backing a bill to disestablish the church. We're working with a member in the House of Lords. This is Lord Paul Scriven. So the bill was introduced back in December and will hopefully get what's called a second reading, where you get a debate. Hopefully that will take place in a couple of months' time. But radical change in our small c conservative country is really a challenge. We are up against quite a strong and determined religious establishment that's trying hard to regain its lost influence. And as a nation, I think we're quite fond of our traditions, but I don't think our love of tradition should really stand in the way of reforms to make the British state fit for the 21st century. I am optimistic, though. The UK's drift away from Christianity, it does look set to continue. All the trends, decline in religious belief and ageing congregation, means that Christianity will inevitably continue to decline. At the same time, non-religiosity, minority faiths, particularly Islam, are seeing significant growth. So for the time being, Anglican may well still be the most widely practiced religion, but there's no guarantee that that's going to continue to be the case. It almost certainly won't. Other religions may well, with some justification, seek the privileges currently enjoyed by the Church of England. But already the majoritarian argument for establishment has gone. The countless scandals and cover-ups of abuse rampant in the church, not only the Catholic Church, the Church of England too, they give lie to any claims that it acts as the nation's moral compass. And the argument from tradition, it really isn't much of an argument at all. It more reveals the absence of an argument, I think. An argument that it's too difficult to achieve, more trouble than it's worth, I think that suggests a really alarming democratic deficit, that we, the people, are powerless over our own constitution. And so for me, that's all the more reason to get on with reform. But there is no great clamour for disestablishment at present. I should probably acknowledge that. But overt support for establishment is weak too. We are seeing this sustained, ongoing process of secularisation, increasing levels of cultural diversity, and a real growing divergence between the ethical views of the church leaders and wider British society. And I think that will all make the current justifications for establishment much harder to sustain. So I think it's a question of when, not if, and obviously our job at the NSS is to make that as soon as possible. Because I think it is clear that we now need a long-term, sustainable settlement on the relationship between religion and state, and that settlement should be based on the principles of secularism. So that means a clear separation between religion and state, freedom of belief, and equality for all, irrespective of religion or belief. Okay, I'll leave it there and look forward to your questions.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Stephen. Very much appreciate all that. There's a number, obviously, I think everybody listening to you can see that there's a lot of similarities between the situation in the UK and the situation in Australia. However, you're facing even more challenges than we are, given the fact of the establishment of the Church of England, whereas we don't have an established church. You did mention the privileges that the bishops, 26 bishops, have to make comment on every piece of legislation that, or potential legislation that is introduced. Obviously, we don't have church people, church leaders as of right in our upper house, our Senate. But we have seen recently the establishment of religious advisory committees in some of the states in Australia. And those religious advisory committees have been set up to have a direct line of advice to the relevant minister. So that's really concerning us. But we don't have religious leaders as of right in our Senate, thank goodness. So we sympathise with you in that regard. We also have, you mentioned the remembrance services, the annual remembrance services, and we have Anzac Day, which is the Australian New Zealand Army Corps, in April of each year. And those services are becoming, I think, more and more religiously oriented. So there is, I think, a concern that all of us have about the creeping religiosity, which might be seen as a the religion, the institutionalized religion, making a sort of fighting back over this decreasing numbers of people who say that they are associated with an institutionalized religion, and even fewer people who say that they are actively a member of a particular institutionalized church. But I guess my first question to you is the people getting this message across to people. One of the ways that the opposition makes their argument is that old phrase, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. How would you, Stephen, and the NSS, what sort of actions do you take to try to counter that argument and to encourage people to consider, well, there is a case for positive change, not just ignoring things that might be in need of reform?
Well, of course, we argue on a point of principle of it's simply a case of equality and fairness, that no religious group should have privileged treatment over another. But you can also look for tangible examples where the Church of England's influence is not a wholly positive one. So, for example, as I mentioned in the talk, there's a real great amount of support in the UK for reform of assisted dying laws to allow, to some extent, people to have a control over their death at the end of their life. There's massive support for that in the UK amongst all sections of society. But as I said, when it came to Parliament, the bishops were united in their opposition. Now, of course, there are genuine concerns around allowing assisted dying, and we need safeguards to make sure that it really is people's free choice. But people recognise that a lot of the objections from religious groups are actually theological objections. So here we have this democratic deficit. We have a group of bishops in Parliament acting on theology, trying to block a law that's very popular amongst the British population. So you can point to egregious examples of where the church influence is not a helpful one for our democracy. Also, their role in schools. We still have laws that require schools to have a daily act of broadly Christian collective worship. We wouldn't have those laws if the church wasn't established. So, what you have to do is find these examples where the Church of England are making a difference. Lots of people, gay people might want to get married in their local church and they can't because the Church of England won't allow it. So you have to find examples of where it impacts on people's lives. A big recruitment sergeant actually for the National Secular Society is the fact that when parents have children and then they look at getting their child into their local school, they often find that unless they go to church, they can't access their local state-funded school. So that's another example of where the privileged role for religion in public life and the exemptions from the Equality Act and all the rest of it, which is, I think, ultimately a privilege that flows from the established status of the church. You point to those examples, and that's how you try and make your case.
Actually, you could point to Australia with respect to voluntary assisted dying. You could point to Australia as an example of a country that has legalized access to voluntary assisted dying, despite the fact that there was strong opposition from institutionalized religion. But because the religious leaders, they do have privileged access behind the scenes to our MPs, we know that, but they don't have that sort of institutionalized as of right sitting in our upper house as you do. And Australia has managed to, over the last number of years, legalized voluntary assisted dying. So we could be an example that you could point to. I've got a couple of questions in the chat box, but before I get to those, there's a few questions that were sent in beforehand that I think I should go through. Bob Stewart from Victoria asked this question. He says, apart from Christianity, are there other religious movements in the UK threatening to desecularize society? In other words, threatening to make UK society more religious? And if there are, what's being done about it in the UK?
Sure. Well, I think any religious influence over public policy is a threat to secularism, and that can come from any religious group. So I think the concept of multi-faithism, this idea that all religions, religious groups should have privileged input or status or access to the political process, I think is worrying. I think the biggest threat to secularism in the UK probably comes from religious fundamentalism, and Islamic fundamentalism is probably causing the most anxiety right now. We are seeing religious fundamentalists trying to impose their beliefs and values on society through intimidation and fear. So we've had a number of incidents in the UK where Islamists have sought to impose blasphemy codes. So we've had, they've been intimidating schools to change curriculums that they don't agree with, usually around sex education and some free speech issues. We've had cinema screenings of films cancelled because the films have been deemed offensive to Muslims. We have a British teacher who had to go into hiding and is now living under a new identity after he showed a cartoon of Muhammad as a teaching resource to teach about free speech issues in schools. We've exposed Muslim schools imposing the hijab as a uniform on very young schoolgirls. So, to see this sort of fundamentalism imposing itself on the UK is a real concern. And we do a lot of work in just exposing and highlighting this. So standing up for the right to free speech, which is, I think, made more difficult by this concept of Islamophobia, which conflates criticism of Islam with hatred against Muslims. So discussions about the threat of Islamic fundamentalism is made all the more difficult. So, we're one of the organizations in the UK that are really pushing decision makers and bodies like government and parliamentary parties to reject the term Islamophobia, because it really hinders the battle, I think, against religious fundamentalism. We also do work highlighting the way that charity law actually enables religion to promote this sort of division. So in a UK law, advancing a religion is regarded as charitable. And that leads to some pretty questionable groups getting charitable status and all the benefits that come from that, benefits of stature and status, but also tax breaks, public money, which is sometimes being used to sow division and promote extremism. We also see fundamentalist religious groups setting up their own unregistered and therefore illegal schools. So these are schools that fail to teach secular subjects and just indoctrinate children in religious dogma and theology, often in unsafe settings. This is primarily happening within the Orthodox Jewish and Muslim communities. So yeah, it is growing fundamentalism, really, that is the, aside from the established status of the Church of England and all the privileges of the church, which is obviously anti-secular, the other attack on the secular state is really coming from religious fundamentalism. Yep. And that is fundamentalism of all stripes. But as I say, I think Islamic fundamentalism is probably causing the most anxiety right now.
Although, if we have a look at what's happening in the United States, and in particular in the state of Alabama recently, there are some forms of Christian fundamentalism that are perhaps as, if not more, concerning. Meg Middleton from South Australia has this question to you, Stephen. Do you have any comments on some states of the USA devolving into theocratic states over women's rights? And what is the long-term view of that sort of move? Meg, I presume, mean of the theocratic movement, not necessarily the NSS movement. Stephen, do you have any comment about what's the fairly recent decision of a judge in the state of Alabama who, in his judgment, this was about IVF, in his judgment, explicitly quoted from the Bible?
Yep, absolutely. It was chilling to read. Make no mistake about it. These are laws based on Christian theology, and it's absolutely chilling, and it should be. It's really frightening, particularly for women's reproductive freedom in the United States. There are clearly those that would quite like to see a Christian theocracy in the USA. I do take some comfort that I mean, it's dreadful for people in America, but the extent to which that can be exported around the country, I have to say I'm skeptical of. In the UK, I think we're on the brink of decriminalizing abortion. We have this abortion law that has criminalized abortion with some exemptions to allow women to have abortions, but abortion has been within the criminal code, and it looks like it's going to be decriminalized. And there's no real momentum, there's no real push for the 24-week limit to be reduced in the UK. There are some fringe voices that want that to happen. So reproductive rights and freedoms in the UK, I think, are in a healthy state. But, there are elements of Eastern Europe where women's reproductive freedoms are really threatened, but no more so than in America, where it is truly chilling. But America is really an outlier. It's just out of sync with most other countries around the world. There was a book written once about, if Americans didn't speak English, how game-changing that would be, because then we'd recognize them for the very different country, that it is. The fact they speak English, we think we have more in common and we're more aligned with them, but we're really not in many ways. It's a strange outlier of a country, but what's going on there, this theocracy, this theocratic mindset that really seems to be taking hold in some states is truly, truly chilling.
Stephen, I have an American partner, and we sometimes joke about whether each of us does speak English. I claim that I do and he doesn't. There's a question from Paul Loring in the chat box, and it sort of relates to the previous point. Paul says, I'm interested in whether current conflicts throughout the world that appear to have a religious dimension will lead to a growth of religion generally, or their decline. Overall, do you have a view about that? Do you have a sense about globally whether this sort of backlash or the rearguard movement from religion will be successful or not?
Obviously, I hope it won't be. I think religious belief is not greatly declining around the world. I think it's increasing. I think there are certain countries, certainly in Western Europe and Australia, Scandinavia and USA, actually, interestingly, where non-religiosity is really growing and secular democracy ideals and principles are flourishing. But globally, I think the picture is a lot more yeah, I think religion is here to stay for a long time. And I do worry about the religious divides that we have in the Middle East at the moment, for example,
Mm.
because of the diaspora populations in around the world. We are seeing these Middle Eastern wars played out in our own countries. We have a real polarized debate in the UK at the moment around Israel and Palestine. And yeah, it's alarming to see. It's alarming to see. So my real concern is that the problems of the Middle East will play out on UK and Australian and American shores, and that's something we really need to guard against. That's why it's really important we kind of try and establish this principle of secularism and liberal democratic values, and we inculcate those into children at a young age. It's not about inculcating religion or non-religion. It's just about having a set of ideals, principles, and values that we can cohere around,
Yeah.
because that's the opposite of this kind of religious division that we're seeing around the globe. So I think the picture for the globe is quite depressing, but in the UK it could be depressing too, unless we establish these values that we can cohere around as a society. And that's why I think we need a secular society, rather than one that really is kind of fragmented, and where we have people living parallel lives with very different mindsets and very different ways of looking at how society should be organized. So yeah, that's the challenge, I think, certainly for Western societies.
Just I'm going to finish up on a couple more questions. Firstly, another one from the chat box. Luke Beck asks, have you ever had any success in persuading the organisers of remembrance services to run those services without religious elements?
Yeah, certainly locally, lots of local groups, they will at least make them inclusive, so they make sure that they're not dominated by the church. The National Service of Remembrance, actually our cenotaph was purposefully designed as a secular building, a secular monument.
Our Shrine of Remembrance, similarly, is a purely secular building or non-religious building.
To make sure it was fully inclusive of everyone that died. The Church of England wanted to have kind of ownership of remembrance, the ceremony, and having it at Westminster Abbey. They wanted a religious monument, but that battle was won many years ago. So we have a secular monument, but at the same time, the Bishop of London leads prayers. All the faith leaders are represented, including a non-religious leader represented as well, the leader of the humanists. They're represented too, but it does still, it does still look like and feel like a church service. So no, we've had there's been, as I say, there's been some development in that we've had a more multi-faith element introduced to it, but making it secular seems to be a much bigger challenge. So no success on that front yet.
We're just about ready to close this up, but I just wanted to take the host's privilege of having one last question myself, and it's this. You probably know that Ayaan Hirsi Ali has recently declared that she has converted to Christianity, having been born into the Muslim faith and then very famously become an atheist, one of the new atheists, if you like. And then just recently she's declared that she's converted to Christianity. Now, my understanding is that it's not that she believes in the doctrine of Christianity, but more that she thinks that it's useful as a bulwark against this creeping religious fundamentalism. Do you have a comment? What do you think about her conversion?
Well, I know that for people who have grown up with a religion, sometimes adopting another religion is much easier than abandoning it altogether. So it's not necessarily a massive surprise that she's gone back to a form of religious thinking, albeit I don't think she believes in Christianity. She does, as you say, just see it. And this is a growing trend that I think we are seeing, as seeing Christianity as the bulwark against Islamization and growing fundamentalism. And also, I think the excesses of some social justice activism, particularly around the transgender identity debate. Things like that, and wokeism is a term I don't like. I think it's very imprecise. But yeah, there is this kind of growing opposition to some of this radical social justice politics, wokeism, if you like, and growing fundamentalism. And some people think that Christianity is the best bulwark against that. I would just simply disagree. I think when Christianity has strength and political power, then it's really bad for fundamental human rights. So if your concern is for fundamental human rights, then I think secularism, rationalism, liberal democratic values and principles are a much stronger bulwark. So I would simply urge people to get behind those secular democratic principles rather than converting to Christianity, which I think it's a flawed approach to tackling the challenges that we face. And also for many people, there's just no going back to Christianity. If people don't believe, they don't believe. So they can't really subscribe to Christianity with any real sincerity. But I would have thought that liberal democratic principles are something that those really interested in preserving and promoting human rights can really get behind.
And I think we can all say hear to that. Stephen, thank you so much for your time and for sharing what's happening in the UK. As I said, I think we share many of the challenges that you have in front of you, but you have even more than we do. So perhaps we can support one another's campaigns. Thank you again. And thank you everybody for joining us tonight. And we'll look forward to seeing you at the next Rationalist Society webinar. Good night for now.